He rescued a trapped bobcat kitten. Then the baby held his glove. Tight Silver City had been parched for nearly 3 straight months. Everything was cracking, from the ground and rocks to the very sound of the wind. The drought forced even wild animals to leave their shelters and creep closer to residential areas in search of water. Elijah Boone was 72 years old and had lived alone on the old farm for 8 years, since his wife Margaret passed in 2017. That morning, he only intended to walk around the yard to check the water pipes, but he heard a very small, broken groan near the barbed wire fence in the back, old and rusted for a long time. A tiny creature was trapped. It was a wild bobcat kitten, no more than 8 to 10 weeks old. One leg was caught in wire mesh, its fur patchy from shedding, ribs showing, breathing weakly. Elijah knelt down and worked the wire free, his rough hands moving carefully to avoid causing more pain. The kitten was too weak to fight. It only trembled as he lifted it and carried it inside. He laid it on an old wool blanket near the kitchen stove and warmed milk on the stovetop, mixing it with a little water. He used an eyedropper to place small amounts near its mouth. The kitten's tongue moved weakly, lapping at the drops before its head sank back down onto the blanket. He named it Cinder right then, for it looked like a spark of life salvaged from the ash of a ruined world. He picked up the phone and called Sarah Mercer, a ranger in the Silver City area whom he recognized from last year's wildfire reports. "Sarah, this is Elijah Boone. Found a bobcat kitten caught in my fence. Bad shape, dehydrated, injured leg. Looks like it's been out there a while." "How old would you say? 8 weeks, maybe 10 at most." Sarah sighed heavily. "Elijah, the drought has every rehab center in the region at capacity. We've got animals coming in faster than we can process them. A kitten that young with an injury is going to need intensive care. And I don't know when we'd be able to get someone out there. Could be days, maybe longer." Elijah looked down at Cinder on the blanket. Its eyes were closed, but its small claws were flexing rhythmically against the fabric, an instinctive reflex action from infancy. What happens if it has to wait that long? Honestly, it might not make it. If the injury is severe, it might end up on a humane euthanasia list. I'm sorry, but that's the reality right now with the resources we have. Elijah was quiet for a moment. The kitten's breathing was evening out slightly, responding to the warmth and the small amount of milk. "If I can meet the proper housing conditions under state regulations, can you issue me a temporary volunteer caretaker permit? I don't want to see it die right on my porch just because there's no space." Sarah's surprise was evident in her voice. "Elijah, that's a serious commitment. You need to upgrade your facilities to meet wildlife standards within 48 hours. I'd have to come out and inspect everything personally." "I understand what's required." "You're absolutely sure about this? It's going to be a lot of work." "I'm sure." "All right then, I'll start the paperwork on my end. You've got 2 days to get everything ready." Elijah hung up the phone and looked down at Cinder. "All right, little one. Looks like you're staying with me." For the next 48 hours, the sound of hammering and sawing echoed across the Boone farm from dawn until well past dark. Elijah worked without stopping except to check on the kitten every few hours and administer water and milk through the eyedropper. He converted the old horse stall in the barn, the one that hadn't been used since Margaret's mare died 5 years ago. He cleared out years of accumulated debris, old hay bales, cobwebs, and dust until the space was completely empty. He hauled in large flat rocks from the creek bed and sections of fallen oak logs from the back pasture to create natural climbing structures the way he'd seen in wildlife rehabilitation photos. He installed heavy-gauge wire mesh over every single opening in the stall, even the smallest gaps, securing each section with industrial staples and checking twice to make sure no predators could possibly get in. He built a raised wooden platform off the ground and lined it with fresh straw he bought from the feed store, then covered that with a piece of thick canvas material, making absolutely sure there were no loose threads or frayed edges that could snag tiny claws. He rigged up an automatic water system using a small livestock trough and a gravity-fed line he connected to the rain barrel outside, ensuring Cinder would always have access to clean water without needing constant human interference that might stress it. He even installed a simple wooden shelter box with an entrance hole sized appropriately for a bobcat. giving the kitten a dark, enclosed space where it could retreat and feel safe when overwhelmed by any stimuli. When Sarah arrived for the inspection on the afternoon of the second day, she stood in the doorway of the stall and said nothing for a full minute, just looking around slowly at everything Elia had constructed. Finally, she turned to face him directly and looked down at his hands, which were covered in fresh cuts and old splinters, his fingernails black with accumulated dirt and sawdust. This is more than adequate, Elia. This exceeds the minimum standards we require. She pulled the temporary permit from her folder and stamped it with her official seal, then set it down on the workbench. You've got 6 months with this permit. After that, we'll need to reassess the situation and see where things stand. Thank you for arranging this, Sarah. Don't thank me yet, me. You're in for a long road ahead. Raising a wild animal, even temporarily, is not like caring for a domestic pet. She left, and Elia returned to the house to collect Cinder. He carried the kitten carefully out to the barn, supporting its small body with both hands, and placed it gently on the straw-lined platform he had built. Cinder's eyes opened briefly, reflecting the slanted afternoon light coming through the gaps in the barnwood, then closed again. But this time, the breathing was deeper and more settled than before. All done. Cinder, from now on, you can stay here safe. Over the following weeks, Elia fell into a strict routine with the animal's care. Every single morning before sunrise, he would enter the stall as quietly as possible and check Cinder's wounded leg carefully for any signs of infection or deterioration. He cleaned the injury site with saline solution and applied a thin layer of antibiotic ointment that Sarah had provided from the Wildlife Center's medical supplies. He changed out all the bedding materials every 3 days without fail and made absolutely sure the water trough was scrubbed clean and refilled with fresh water daily. Cinder began to gain strength slowly but steadily over time. The kitten started taking the warmed milk more readily, drinking larger amounts at each feeding, and eventually Elia was able to introduce small pieces of cooked chicken that he shredded into tiny portions. The injured leg healed crookedly, the bones having set at a slight angle that would leave a permanent limp. But the infection cleared up completely, and the patchy fur began to grow back over the scarred tissue. On warm afternoons when the temperature rose, Elia would carry Cinder out to the front porch and set the kitten down on an old braided rug in a patch of direct sunlight. Cinder would stretch out carefully, extending its front paws slowly and flexing its claws in and out repeatedly, kneading the air in an instinctive motion that kittens make while nursing from their mothers. Elia would watch from his rocking chair, his cup of coffee cooling forgotten in his hand, as the kitten went through these natural behaviors. Some evenings, when Elia returned late from working in the yard repairing fence posts or clearing brush, he would find Cinder waiting anxiously near the door of the stall, making a small chirping sound that echoed slightly in the enclosed space. The kitten would try to stand up on its hind legs to reach higher, then inevitably collapse forward into Elia's outstretched, gloved hands. The tiny claws would grip desperately at the worn leather of his work gloves, holding on with a fierce determination that spoke of an absolute need to connect. Elia spoke to Cinder often during the daily care routines, his voice low and steady and constant. He told the kitten stories about Margaret, about the way she used to wake up before dawn to work in her vegetable garden during the cool morning hours, about the particular sound of her laughter when something genuinely amused her. Cinder would watch him intently with those amber-colored eyes, ears swiveling and rotating to catch every word and intonation of his voice. 6 weeks after Cinder's initial arrival at the farm, Elia was standing in the kitchen washing the dinner dishes when he heard a sudden commotion and thrashing sounds coming from somewhere near the back fence line. He grabbed his heavy flashlight from the counter drawer and went outside quickly, his boots crunching on the dry grass, near the same section of sagging barbed wire where he had found Cinder. Another bobcat kitten was desperately trying to squeeze its body through a narrow gap in the twisted metal strands. This one was noticeably older than Cinder had been, perhaps 12 or even 14 weeks based on its size, and female based on certain physical characteristics. Her fur was heavily matted with accumulated dust and dried blood, and she was panting rapidly with her mouth open. Her sides heaved with each labored breath. Elia approached slowly and carefully, but the kitten immediately hissed sharply at him and backed away several feet. her body low to the ground in a defensive posture. He could clearly see deep claw marks raked along her flank and a partially torn ear that was still bleeding slightly. She had obviously been chased by something, most likely the pack of stray dogs that had been roaming the outskirts of town for the past month. She managed to force herself through the fence opening and then collapsed heavily in the corner of the yard, her eyes wide and unblinking and full of wary suspicion. Elia did not make any attempt to touch her or approach closer. He went back inside the house and filled a large ceramic bowl with cool water from the tap, then carried it outside and placed it on the ground several feet away from where she lay watching him. He turned off the flashlight to reduce the stress of the bright beam and went back inside, deliberately leaving the barn door standing open as an invitation. The next morning when the sun came up, the kitten was asleep on an old wool blanket that Elia had left folded outside the stall entrance the night before. She woke immediately when he approached and hissed again sharply, baring her small teeth. But she did not attempt to run away this time. Elia stood completely still for a long moment, not moving at all. "All right then, I'll call you Vesper, like the evening star that appears at dusk." He went inside and called Sarah's number again. "Sarah, it's Elia. I've got another one now." Sarah was silent for a beat on the other end of the line. "Elia, you know the state regulations on this. You absolutely cannot house two wild animals in the same enclosure space without proper separation barriers in place. That's non-negotiable." "I know the rules. I'll build a partition wall today to divide the space. I just need you to add her to my existing permit." "Are you completely sure you want to take this on two animals is significantly more work and responsibility?" "I'm sure about this," Sarah agreed after another moment of consideration. Elia spent the entire rest of that day constructing a solid wooden divider wall down the exact center of the stall space. The partition was sturdy and well built, assembled from thick planks, but he deliberately left a few small gaps and openings near the floor level, just wide enough for the kittens to see each other clearly through the barrier and pick up each other's scent. Vesper was fundamentally different from Cinder in temperament and behavior. Where Cinder had been weak and surrendering and accepting from the start, Vesper was tense and vigilant and resistant to any interaction. She did not want to be touched under any circumstances. She barely ate anything at all for the first 3 full days after her arrival, but she watched absolutely everything with intense focus. Her blue-gray eyes tracked and followed every single movement that Elia made, constantly calculating and assessing potential threats. Cinder, isolated on the other side of the partition wall, seemed to sense instinctively that another creature was present nearby. The younger kitten would press its face hard against the gaps in the wooden boards, making soft chirping and trilling sounds repeatedly. At first, Vesper completely ignored these persistent attempts at communication and contact, but gradually, over the course of a full week, Elia began to notice her moving incrementally closer to the divider. She would lie down on her side, positioning herself just inches away from where Cinder rested on the opposite side of the barrier. One afternoon, while Elia was refilling water troughs, he heard a new sound that he hadn't heard before, a low, rumbling purr that resonated in the enclosed space. It was coming distinctly from Vesper's side of the divided stall. He approached as quietly as possible and saw her lying with her face pressed firmly to one of the gaps in the partition. And on the other side, Cinder was doing exactly the same thing. Their noses were almost touching through the narrow opening in the wood, separated by less than an inch. Elia made a decision in that moment. He opened the partition. He stayed close and alert, ready to intervene immediately if things went wrong or if aggression developed. Cinder hobbled forward first, moving awkwardly and unevenly on the still healing injured leg. Vesper tensed visibly, her entire body lowering into a defensive crouch with muscles coiled. But then Cinder made a small sound, something between a chirp and a trill, and Vesper's ears relaxed noticeably and rotated forward. Vesper moved forward slowly and deliberately. She approached Cinder carefully and sniffed thoroughly at the younger kitten's face and whiskers, then moved down to examine the scarred leg closely. And then, in a gesture so gentle, it made Elia unconsciously hold his breath. Vesper began to groom Cinder methodically. Her rough tongue moved over the patchy fur on Cinder's shoulder in long strokes, cleaning away accumulated dust and flakes of dried skin. Cinder leaned heavily into the contact, eyes closing completely in obvious contentment. The two kittens stayed like that together for several long minutes. Elia backed away quietly and carefully, leaving them alone together. From that day forward, they were completely inseparable. Vesper took on the role of protector and guide naturally and automatically. She was always at the very first to investigate any new sound or unexpected movement in the environment. She would thoroughly check every single corner of the stall space before allowing Cinder to follow her into that area. At night, when darkness fell, they slept curled together in a tight ball on the raised platform, with Vesper's noticeably larger body wrapped protectively around Cinder's smaller frame. Elia watched them interact and felt something stirring inside him that he had not felt in many years. The days had structure and purpose again. The oppressive silence in the house was broken regularly now, not by his own solitary voice, but by the sound of life actively continuing and healing and growing stronger. One afternoon, while he was cleaning out the stall and replacing soiled bedding, Elia accidentally knocked a metal feed scoop off the shelf where it was sitting. It hit the concrete floor with a sharp, ringing clang that echoed harshly. Cinder bolted immediately and instinctively, letting out a shriek of pure terror and shoving itself desperately into the far corner, pressing its body hard against the wall. The kitten's breathing became rapid and panicked, coming in short gasps, and its eyes were wide and unfocused and seeing something that wasn't there. Elia froze completely in place, but Vesper moved much faster than he could. She stepped directly between Cinder and the source of the frightening noise, her ears standing upright and alert. She made a low chirping sound repeatedly, then slowly lay down, close in front of Cinder, deliberately blocking the younger kitten from view of the rest of the stall. Slowly and gradually, Cinder's breathing began to steady and return to normal. Vesper stayed exactly where she was, maintaining her protective position, until Cinder finally crept forward tentatively and pressed its body against her side for comfort. Elia stood there for a long moment, his own breathing slowing down to match theirs. He watched them carefully, then picked up the scoop and set it back on the shelf, this time making sure it was secure. As the weeks passed steadily, the two kittens grew visibly stronger and more coordinated. Cinder's limp became much less pronounced with exercise and use, and Vesper's various wounds healed completely without scarring. They began to play together actively, engaging in the mock hunts and practice pounces that wild kittens instinctively use to develop their hunting skills and reflexes. Vesper was always extremely careful during play, consciously never using her full strength or weight, and she always allowed Cinder to win their wrestling matches. One morning while Elia was sitting and observing them, he dozed off unexpectedly in the old wooden rocking chair that he had moved and placed near the stall for easier monitoring. His hand hung down loosely at his side, rough and heavily scarred from decades of farm work and manual labor. He woke suddenly to the sensation of something warm and soft against his knuckles. Vesper was sitting quietly beside the chair, her head pressed gently but firmly against the back of his weathered hand. She was not asking for food or demanding affection or attention. She was simply there, present. Elia sat absolutely still, barely breathing at all, not wanting to break the moment. After a full minute passed, Vesper stood up slowly and walked back across the stall to where Cinder was sleeping peacefully on the raised platform. Cinder no longer whimpered or cried out each night the way it had during the first weeks. At the smallest unexpected sound, Vesper would immediately be there, using her larger body to shelter and protect her smaller companion from perceived threats. Cinder's natural innocence and absolute trust gradually softened Vesper's sharp defensive instincts over time. As the older and larger one, Vesper naturally became the guide and scout through every corner of the farm property, always staying one full step ahead, checking for safety and potential dangers before allowing Cinder to set foot in any new area. Then came the day when Cinder made its first truly successful pounce in life, managing to catch a dry brown leaf that was blown across the stall floor by the wind. The kitten that had once collapsed from complete exhaustion could now leap powerfully with all the strength of its muscled hind legs. Vesper did not pounce on the leaf with Cinder. She only stood there watching the achievement carefully, then deliberately placed one of her paws right beside Cinder's paw print in the dust on the floor. In late October, The devastating drought finally broke after nearly 4 months. Rain came down in heavy sheets, drumming loudly on the tin barn roof and quickly turning the cracked earth to thick mud. Elias stood in the open doorway and watched the water pour from the gutters in streams. That same night, his heart failed without warning. He was standing in the kitchen, putting away clean dishes when the pain hit. A crushing and overwhelming weight in his chest that drove him immediately to his knees on the floor. He tried desperately to reach for the phone on the counter, but his arm would not obey the commands from his brain. He fell forward heavily, his cheek pressing hard against the cold linoleum. In the barn, Vesper heard the distinctive sound of his fall from within the safety of their stall. She had always been closely attuned to every single noise in the house, every creak of floorboards and footstep. But this sound was completely different from anything she had heard before. Unable to reach him, she began to cry out loudly from behind the wire mesh. It was not the hiss of aggression or the chirp of friendly greeting. It was a wild, piercing alarm call that she had never made before. The cry rose and fell repeatedly, echoing through the barn and out into the night air. Tom Fletcher, Elias' nearest neighbor who lived a quarter-mile down the road, heard the strange sound clearly through his bedroom window. He sat up in bed, confused by the unfamiliar noise. He pulled on his boots quickly and followed the frantic cries directly to Elias' property. Through the open barn door, he saw Vesper pacing the enclosure, her eyes reflecting his flashlight beam as she continued to scream. Tom ran immediately to the house and found Elias collapsed on the floor. He called for an ambulance, his hands shaking as he dialed. Elias survived. The doctors told him repeatedly that he had been only minutes away from death when the paramedics arrived. When he was finally released from the hospital, 2 full weeks later, he returned to the farm noticeably weak and shaken. Sarah came to visit him the day after he got home. "They saved you, Elias," she said firmly, sitting across from him at his kitchen table. Vesper especially, that call she made, that was completely deliberate. She knew something was wrong. Elias nodded slowly. "I know she did." "They're ready now, Elias. You know that, don't you? They're strong enough." He looked out the window toward the barn. "I know." It took him another full week to truly accept it. He called Sarah and made the final arrangements. She would meet him at the edge of the State Forest Reserve, where the land was protected and the bobcat population was stable. On the morning of the release, Elias did not bring a transport cage. He simply opened the stall door wide and walked outside into the yard, and Cinder and Vesper followed him naturally. They had never been beyond the barn before, and they moved very cautiously, sniffing the air constantly and testing each step carefully before committing their weight. Elias drove slowly and carefully, keeping the truck windows open, with the kittens riding in the cab beside him. Cinder sat on the bench seat, looking out at the passing landscape with wide eyes. Vesper stood with her front paws up on the dashboard, ears swiveling constantly to catch every sound. Sarah was waiting at the trailhead when they arrived. She did not speak. She simply nodded once and gestured toward the forest. Elias carried Cinder first, walking carefully down the narrow, overgrown path until he reached a small clearing where the undergrowth was thick and the trees provided heavy cover. He set Cinder down gently on the soft grass. The young bobcat looked up at him, amber eyes clear and bright. He went back for Vesper and carried her to the same spot. She was heavier now, her muscles lean and strong and well-developed. He set her down beside Cinder, and the 2 kittens immediately pressed together tightly. Elias stepped back several paces. He wanted to speak, to say something that would mark the moment, but no words came to him. He simply stood there, watching. Vesper moved first. She took a few cautious steps toward the trees, then looked back at Cinder. Cinder followed, limping slightly but keeping pace. They reached the edge of the clearing, and then Cinder stopped and turned around. For a long moment, the young bobcat looked directly at Elias. Its short bobtail twitched once, twice, a small involuntary movement, and then both kittens disappeared into the undergrowth, and the forest swallowed them completely. Elias stood in the clearing for a long time, listening to the sound of their movement growing fainter and fainter until there was only silence and wind. Sarah drove him home. He did not speak during the entire drive. When they arrived at the farm, she helped him out of the truck and walked him to the door. You did a good thing. Elia. I know. Will you be all right? He looked at her and nodded once. I will, after she left. Elia walked slowly to the barn. He stood in the empty stall for a long time, looking at the platform and the water trough and the climbing structures he had built with his own hands. The space felt hollow now, but not empty. Something had happened here. Something had been saved. Then he went to the shed and retrieved his wire cutters from the tool rack. He spent the next 3 full days removing every section of barbed wire from the back fence line. He cut each strand carefully and methodically, rolling up the wire and hauling it piece by piece to the scrap pile behind the equipment barn. The work was slow and painful, his hands still weak from the hospital stay and his chest aching with every deep breath. But he did not stop or rest. When the last piece of rusted wire was finally gone, he stood in the open space and looked at what remained. The fence had been there for 40 years, installed when he and Margaret had first bought the property. Now it was gone. He ordered native grass seed from the county extension office and spent a full week preparing the soil, turning it and raking it smooth. He planted the seeds in neat rows according to the instructions on the package, watering them carefully each evening as the sun went down. Margaret had always loved the way the native grasses moved in the wind, their seed heads catching the golden light. The grass grew quickly in the aftermath of the heavy rains. By early December, the back section of the property had transformed into a small meadow, the young grass already 6 inches tall and spreading. Birds began to appear almost immediately, building nests in the tall stalks and foraging for seeds. Rabbits made burrows at the edges where the meadow met the tree line. Once, Elia saw a family of quail leading their chicks through the grass in a perfect single-file line, the babies following their mother exactly. He began spending his evenings on the porch, a cup of coffee in his weathered hands, watching the meadow as the light slowly faded from the sky, and sometimes, just as the sun touched the distant horizon, he would see them, 2 small dark silhouettes on the far hill, backlit by the dying light. They never came closer to the house. They were wild now, fully returned to the life they were meant to live, but they would stand there together, completely motionless, for several minutes at a time. And Cinder, always Cinder, would stay just a little longer than Vesper before following her into the shadows. The young bobcat's stubby tail would twitch in a slow, irregular rhythm, and Elia would raise his hand in silent response, holding it steady in the air. Some evenings they did not appear at all, and Elia would sit and watch the empty hill anyway, finishing his coffee in the gathering darkness. But on the evenings when they did appear, he would sit absolutely still and watch without moving until they finally turned and disappeared back into the forest. And then he would finish his coffee slowly and go inside, closing the door quietly behind him. Winter came to Silver City with surprising gentleness after the brutal summer drought. The meadow turned brown and brittle as the first cold winds arrived. Snow fell in thin layers that melted quickly in the pale winter sunlight, leaving the ground damp and dark. Elia kept the porch cleared of ice and kept the coffee hot, and every single evening without exception, he stepped outside to look toward the distant hills. On Christmas Eve, as the sun set behind the western mountains, Elia saw them again. This time they were noticeably closer than usual, standing at the very edge of the meadow where the new grass met the old forest. Vesper's coat had grown thick and full for winter, her body strong and healthy. Cinder had filled out as well. No longer the skeletal kitten he had pulled from the wire. They stood side by side, watching the house in the fading light, and then Cinder's stubby tail twitched deliberately. Once, twice, 3 times in quick succession. Elia raised his hand slowly and held it there, steady and unwavering, until they both turned together and vanished into the darkening trees. He lowered his hand gradually and went inside, closing the door against the cold. The fire was burning low in the wood stove, and the house was warm and quiet. He sat in his chair and looked across the room at the empty space where Margaret's chair used to be, the space he had left vacant for 8 long years. He could look at it now without his chest tightening, without the crushing weight of loss pressing down on him. Outside, the wind moved through the meadow in long, sweeping waves, bending the brown grass flat and then releasing it. The stars began to appear one by one in the clear winter sky, cold and distant and eternal. And somewhere out there in the vast darkness of the forest, two young bobcats moved silently through the night, hunting and playing and living the wild lives they were always meant to live. Every evening after that, Elias stepped onto the porch with his coffee, just to look. Sometimes he saw two small silhouettes standing on the far hilltop against the sky. They did not come closer, did not break the boundary between wild and human. But Cinder, the first child he had saved from certain death, always stood there just a little longer than Vesper. Backlit by the sunset, the stubby tail would twitch in that same irregular rhythm, like a greeting in the ancient language of living beings who had once been lost and broken. Some partings do not bear the shadow of loss, but represent the final completion of a healing journey. The two young ones did not abandon the old man. They simply carried the warmth of his humanity forward to rewrite the laws of the wild. Nor did Elia lose them. He merely held on to the peace they left in his heart. In the end, they never truly parted. They simply lived where they belonged. The cats to the open sky of freedom, and the old man to a soul that had finally found its way home. Every rescue begins with a heartbeat that refuses to give up. We're grateful you chose to listen to this one. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, a simple like or subscribe means the world to us.